Well, this is a fine topic to find myself in, isn't it? US Naval Aviation. Now, for starters, I'm going to explain a couple of things. One, US Naval Aviation, and we're talking about carrier naval aviation because this is the year of the aircraft carrier, can accurately be said to have three versions in terms of long-range maritime patrol: that of the Coast Guard, that of the US Navy, and that of the US Army Air Corps. All had their own practices for naval aviation and doctrine in this period. And then you have the carrier aviation, which actually can be divided into two, because there's the US Marine Corps' carrier aviation doctrines, and there's the US Navy's carrier aviation doctrine. And whilst they're theoretically the same, they're actually not, because it gets fun. And then you have ground support doctrine, which basically the US Marine Corps write, but the US Navy keeps trying to jump into. It's brilliant. It's brilliant. And the point I'm going to make here is, if you would like to see videos about those other sections, i.e. the long-range maritime patrol doctrine and the ground support doctrine, I would be glad to do them. But they're going to have to be patron suggestions at the moment, or they're going to be Christmas specials. Comment below if you'd like them done. But they're not going to be included in this video, apart from in terms of references, because then it just grows into about a 6-7 hour video as I explain all the overlaps and where they all nuance in together. And I'd also like to point out this. There are some discussions around US naval aviation which it's achieved so much, and it is so good, that sometimes to differentiate themselves, I swear authors give it laurels it actually didn't earn, or alternatively just presume the source in front of them which claims they'd earned it is correct. The example I'll give comes from Peter Smith's book. Now, Peter Smith, just to underscore this, is someone who does not say nice things about Tribal class destroyers in at least 2 of his books. In fact, he's quite rude about them in my view. Now, we can disagree on that, but the fact I'm saying nice things about his book and him when he does that shows that this is really something I agree on. Just about the only certain thing about the origins of the form of aircraft attack using bombs on a steep dive, and known as dive bombing, is that nobody is certain just who originated it. Very few historians seem to agree about it, although the general consensus has been that it was the United States Marine Corps aviators in Central and South America who first brought this technique to a fine art. Whilst not wishing to detract one iota from the considerable achievement of those early pioneers, my own researches have led to the firm conclusion that the true dive bombing dates from earlierness, from the latter years of the First World War in fact, in particular from one attack by a British pilot on the Western Front, Harry Brown of No. 84 Squadron, Royal Air Force. Much of the confusion and doubt as to the origins of dive bombing stems from the attempts to define clearly the angle of attack, which could rightly be classified as dive bombing, as distinct from glide or shallow bombing runs. Shallow glide bombing has been defined as taking place when an aircraft is descending at an angle of 20 degrees or less. Steep glide bombing, when the airplane is descending at angles of between 20 degrees and 60 degrees, and true dive bombing is therefore seen by many to be confined to attacks wherein the aircraft approaches the target at an angle of 60 degrees or more. While such a rule of thumb is convenient in its application, it cannot be made hard and fast and absolute. In the early days, instrumentation was primitive, and no particular record was kept of the angle at which an attack was made, save that it was a steep dive. Furthermore, with the development of specialised dive-bombing aircraft, many of the most important attacks which subsequently took place by these aircraft were made at angles of less than 60 degrees. They are nonetheless classic dive-bombing attacks by any normal reasoning. In fact, then, especially in the early years, dive and glide bombing are difficult, if not almost impossible, to classify separately. Now, here's where you get the problem, because that's just said various things, and actually I disagree with him on that, because I would say there is a Royal Naval Air Service attack in 1914, which they state they took a deep dive from directly overhead the target. Well, that would suggest to me if they're overhead the target and deep dive down, it must be greater than 60 degrees. It must be. But of course they don't have instrumentation, they're not telling you, so you cannot prove it. But the thing is, it's quite a common idea for people, for pilots to think, well, if we dive down at a target, point ourselves at a target, we can loose a target in that direction. However, if we read this otherwise exceptional book, and this is a really exceptional book, this is 100 Years of US Navy Air Power, edited by Douglas Smith. It is an wonderful book and I really enjoy it. But Douglas Smith himself, in this section, writes this. Now, where is it? There it is. One major obstacle to operational success had to overcome through innovation, concerned that their extended time over target would make his bombers vulnerable to anti-aircraft fire. Reeves and Lieutenant Commander Frank D. Wanger, the commanding officer of his fighter wing, devised what subsequently came to be known as dive bombing. Now, I love Admiral Reeves, and frankly, Wanger is a pretty darn good pilot. But this is taking place in 1926. No. But the thing is, you can believe it because the US Navy is that good. So this is one of the problems, and US Naval Aviation is that good. One of the problems when it comes to talking about their doctrine, there is what their doctrine actually was and what their doctrine has been ascribed, and what capabilities have been ascribed to them versus the reality. And then, of course, you have the fact that there's always a fight between the US Marine Corps and the US Navy over who thought of it first. But I hope you enjoyed the video. I hope you enjoyed the discussion. And if there are any points at which you're going, hang on, that's not quite right. Well, it could be because I have done as much research as I can to ascribe the laurels correctly, where they are due. If I'm wrong, I'm sorry. But my historical inclination is always to say, right then, this can be developed at multiple times from multiple people approaching the same problem and coming with a similar solution. That is quite possible with dive bombing. However, due to the sheer intermix of the US Navy and the Royal Navy over naval aviation and the Imperial Japanese Navy over naval aviation during the latter part of World War I, the fact that ideas cross-pollinate between the three and it becomes difficult to really discern who matures these ideas is not really a surprise to me. In which case, normally I'll ascribe it to whoever's done something like it first. So, if I can find a prior event which fits that criteria, as with dive bombing, I will go, right then, so that's a Royal Navy idea. If I can provide a prior event that is done by the Imperial Japanese Navy, then it's them. And if it's the US Navy, it's them. That is the criteria I use for who thought of it first. But that does not affect how they employ it. It's just trying to be historically accurate about who was using it first. Tribals, battles, and darings. See? This is another reason why you know that Smith must be right, is the fact that he's not nice about tribals, and I'm still bringing him up. Now, this is of course a shameless book plug, and I put this in all my videos. Why? Well, two things. One, the support of the channel, people liking, sharing, and subscribing it, really does help it grow, and it helps me reach more people with more naval history. And secondly, I'm an academic. I love being an academic, but in the UK, at least, the only way you can get a permanent post and get promoted is by book publications and by number of books published and journal articles. And even with the books published and the number of them sold, they tend to prefer ones which are done by through publishers done self-published. But I'm going to be trying the latter later this year, hopefully, if the move and everything goes to plan. So, this is it. This is my book. It's in second edition, and thank you to everyone who has bought a copy. And if you're interested in the development of destroyers in the Royal Navy in the 1930s, World War II, and post-World War II, and how the modern destroyer concept of a general-purpose destroyer came to be rather than a super torpedo vessel, I hope you enjoyed the book. So let's start off with who I would consider the originator of US Naval Aviation Doctrine. I consider it Sims. Now, here is one of the interesting things. I did my PhD under Andrew Lambert at King's College London. He's Lawson Chair of Naval History. He's a professor of naval history there. At the same time, a very nice US Navy officer and helicopter pilot, Benjamin Armstrong, was doing his. And he is An absolute Mahan, Sims, all these thinkers. Oh, he is absolutely amazing. And I doubt he will remember this conversation, but I remembered it because I was in my PhD. I was doing the study of um, various things to do with development of naval aviation. And I was going. They keep referring back to the War College. And I keep referring back to the Naval War College and the war games they were playing prior to them having carriers. Who was in charge? And he went Sims. I went, what do you know about him? He was bright. You need to go look him up. And that started me working on Sims. Now, Armstrong's book on Sims is frankly fantastic. And if I hadn't already packed it in a box somehow, and not sure which box it's in, it would be here next to me, alongside this book, and the other 24 books I have here for this video. But I cannot recommend it highly enough. Now, Sims is special. Sims is not afraid to speak truth of power, and that probably is what stops him becoming Chief of the Navy. It's probably what stops his promotion to full admiral when he's in the service and he becomes an admiral retired. He starts almost immediately when he gets back from World War I, and he returns to being in charge of Naval War College, which is the US Navy's premier wargaming institution. And please note, wargaming has such a weird reputation outside of naval circles and a lot of discussion. People think of it as, oh, you're just throwing toys around and things. No. You have very strict rules. And if it's done properly, it can truly illuminate the future. It can truly show you what is going to happen. And it was by wargaming that Sims showed that the admirals who were focusing on carriers being spotter systems, supporting spotters, were wrong. That carriers were going to be useful strike assets, that they were going to be offensive weapons all their own, that they were going to be some of the most offensive tools available. He also starts to come up with puts forward the criteria that the first thing they have to do in a fight is eliminate their counterparts. Control the air is best achieved by eliminating your counterparts, eliminating those other carriers. And it's very well put. It's very sensibly put. And he's able to show this through wargaming again and again and again. And the thing about Naval War College is because it's the best and the brightest of the US Navy officers of that generation coming together, you can grow a massive capacity in that time. You can truly develop personnel. So when he's in charge of the War College for 3 years, and a year prior to his involvement in World War I, he truly gets to inoculate his thinking into the US Navy, into multiple generations, and his successors carry on that. Sims is by far and away the progenitor of the modern US Navy. And you will hear less about him than you hear about Mahan, Corbett, and all the others. Because whilst he does write, and there are some wonderful works written by him, truly wonderful works, and again, it's something to go and consider and read. I would say the victory at sea, his account of the US naval war effort, is a really, really key document for you to understand the US and the US Navy's lessons from World War I. But he doesn't do as much public work, he does a lot more internal work. And he is always happy to challenge anyone to a war game when he's testing his theories out. And he produces the generation of officers who go on to really grow US naval aviation and come up with the doctrines of it. So he's starting off with this idea of, okay, fine, carriers are offensive weapons. Carriers are capable assets. And what he comes up with was primarily the carrier to first get ordnance on the other carrier's deck, normally is the winning side. And secondly, the carrier which is able to launch the largest group, the quickest of aircraft, usually wins. And if you consider those 2 points, suddenly, looking at US Naval Aviation and US carriers up until this day, entirely fit with that doctrine. When they are building what they want to build, not what they're building for a war contingency or some kind of treaty mandate, that is their criteria. The carrier that can put the bomb on the other carrier decks first, and which can launch the most aircraft most quickly. That's the criteria. And that's been the driving force of US Naval Aviation and US Navy carrier doctrine since 1919. Which leads to some really interesting things, because Fleet Problems 1 and 2, they come in, and I would like you to introduce you to your aircraft carriers for Fleet Problems 1 and 2. They are the USS New York and the USS Oklahoma. They're your aircraft carriers for Fleet Problems 1 and 2. We do not even have Langley available. We are going to conduct an exercise where we are going to simulate air power's involvement. How are we going to do this? We are going to detail 2 battleships off to be the carriers. Now, I find this really cool, and I can point to no other navy which does the same. The Royal Navy has aircraft carriers, so they don't need to. And the IJN are waiting on the Hosho. They truly are. While trying to think it through. So the only navy which does a simulation where it's battleships, I'm trying to think of what we should describe them, adopt a carrier identity. There are many bad jokes I could make here which would get me cancelled, which I will not make, but please note my brain has thought of them. But as a historian, I know my sense of humour is terrible, and I'm definitely never going to be a comedian, so we're moving on. But aircraft carriers, battleships as aircraft carriers. Fleet Problems 1 and 2. And these are interesting problems they have. They are held off the coast of Panama, and they are mostly about dealing problems between Blue and Black Force. They were both assigned to be aircraft carriers modelled on the capabilities of the USS Langley, of course, which is a converted collier, the Jupiter. And a single plane was launched from Oklahoma that represented a 15-plane squadron, dropped 10 miniature bombs, and theoretically managed to destroy the spillway of the Gatun Dam, which ended the fleet problem, and this was protecting the Panama Canal. What's fun is that this all took place in front of members of Congress. This is the other really cool thing about the fleet problems, and a difference from the massive Royal Navy exercises which take place in the Mediterranean, etc. The US Congress go along to them. The US Navy does a lot to publicize its efforts, and I think this is one of the reasons why the US Navy, in terms of historical terms of attribution and getting itself publicized, its history, accepted as it, always being the first of these things, is because it does such a better job of publicization. Basically, the US Navy operates on the idea that if everyone knows our capabilities, they know not to mess with us. Whereas other navies tend to operate on a mixture of, we want people to have an impression of our capabilities as X, we want to have real capabilities Y. Some navies, that Y is greater value than X. In others, it is lesser than X. But it's a difference. And it's a difference in approach, which also features into what at this time was called grand strategy. Today is called geostrategy. We've got away from the concept of using the word grand, but let's be honest, we've gone up from grand to global, so I don't think our aspirations have shrunk in any way, shape, or form. These started off the idea of, hang on, we can do strikes. That's what these ships did. These exercises, these fleet problems, these ships started off the idea of aircraft strikes. Works. We've done it in exercise, we've done it in our wargaming. We can do this. We can use these strike capabilities. So when you start talking about the 1942 raids, the carrier raids, and you want to say, well, where can we really take that back to? You can take it back to an extent as far as Sims, but realistically, he's talking more about carrier versus carrier concept, concept of operations. You can take those raids and the fact the US Navy had faith for the damage they could do back to Fleet Problems 1 and 2. Back to 1923. An attack on the Gatun Dam. This is US naval doctrine. It is one of the most evolutionary doctrines going, because whereas the Royal Navy's doctrine is, in terms of naval aviation terms, is in fits and starts. They have years where it's almost malaise because of the fights with the Air Ministry and lack of senior officers, and then suddenly you get, in 1930, Henderson appointed as Rear Admiral Aircraft Carriers, brings together all the strands, and you start having this doctrine emerge of night strikes, of long-range strikes, of repeated constant attacks and constant movement, and how to deal with the problems of the Mediterranean South China Sea, and eventually how that leads into the armored hangar carriers, etc., and all that stuff. The US Naval Aviation Doctrine starts out in the early 1920s, in 1920 really itself, and starts to evolve through wargaming, through exercises, through fleet problems, the whole way through the period. And so what is correct to saying the doctrine believes this at one point might not be correct for what it says at the next point. So again, I'm going to build through the doctrine and talk it through as it goes and it evolves. But before you write, no, that wasn't what the doctrine says in the comment below, wait till we get to the end, because it might be the doctrine said that at that point, and that's why I'm talking about it at that point. Now, dive bombing is a specifically interesting thing for the US Navy at this point, because torpedoes are the certain weapon, but getting the torpedoes to kill range of battleships, and I know these two are carriers, I know they're carriers, they're carriers as far, you should be seeing carriers in front of you, but letting them represent battleships now, to kill battleships, you need to make a large hole which lets a lot of water in, or start a fire which they can't put out. You have to do that to kill most ships, in fact all ships pretty much. But battleships tend to be heavily armoured and more difficult to do. So torpedoes are the weapon to do that. But how do you get the torpedo bombers in? And this is where dive bombing comes in, because they're looking at it as going, we can attack with our torpedo bombers, but can we guarantee they'll hit? Can we guarantee, after all the effort, that they will not be shot down, that they will not be fiercely opposed? Because let's be honest, the most predictable line of attack, the most dangerous line of attack is a torpedo bomber, because they have to fly level and steady in a straight line while dropping their torpedo. And they don't do it just for half a second. They have to do it for 10, 15 seconds. Maybe longer than that if they're lining up their attack and they aren't able to swoop in to attack because of the position of the enemy ships and the maneuvering going on around them. And that's the problem for torpedo bombers, and therefore that's the reason you start to have dive bombers and the development of these bombing aircraft, because they are there to get the torpedo bombers through. And this thinking is started in this period. We're talking about 1923. We're talking about 1924. And when Langley comes into service, she is truly a problem for this. Because as she's built, she doesn't fit with Sim's ideas. And her first captain, and by captain, I mean the commander of aircraft squadron for the battle fleet and captain of naval aviation, he'd actually commanded her when she was a collier. And he will go on, and to be a big feature and discussion point in a bit, Reeves. Admiral Joseph M. Reeves. And Bull Reeves is often considered the father of naval aviation in the US Navy. He is certainly the originator of many of its ideas, and he takes a lot of Sims theories and turns them into practice. But we're talking about Langley at this point, and at this point, frankly, he is there thanks to the work of people like Moffat. And Moffat has made it possible for him to be there because, well, in what was probably a sensible decision from the point of view of providing career prospects for naval aviators and allowing them to be promoted and allowing them to get ahead, US Congress has decided that only if you've been a naval aviator, technically a pilot, but they expanded that to include observers, etc., within the definition of pilots and naval aviators, can you command things like air stations and carriers. And this is why Reeves had to go off and qualify as a Naval Aviation Observer. He got this qualification in 1925, and, well, he gets Langley. He gets Langley at this point, and he goes aboard and goes, this doesn't fit. This doesn't fit what we want at all. It doesn't fit. Reeves went through the War College in 1924, and he'd so impressed the team there, including Lanning, the head of tactics, that he was nominated to be, well, decided that it was going to be, that he would be the successor to Lanning as the head of tactics at the Naval War College. So he really did know what he was talking about, and when he got aboard, well, as said, he was not happy. And remember, this is a man who's testified in front of Congress about the power of naval aviation, about the power of carriers, due to wargaming. So, when he gets aboard his ship, his command, which had once been his ship as the Jupiter, and he says, this command lacks a coordinated set of fleet plane tactics and has no concept of capabilities and limitations of the Air Force. And again, this is from Douglas V. Smith's excellent chapter in here. I might have critiqued the dive bombing section, but that's because it's dive bombing and it's absolute mess for anyone to try and work out where the full details of that particular history, because it's kind of an obvious solution to a problem. How do I accurately hit a target with an aircraft and firing my launching a bomb at it? Well, I can just drop and hope gravity does the work, or I can assist gravity in the direction. But the thing is, Reeves goes through this, and he works to sort out Langley's sortie rate, to deal with the interval time between takeoffs, all sorts of problems they are having with this ship, because it doesn't fit the model which their wargaming is requiring of a carrier. And this is another interesting thing when we start to get further on, because as you go into a first air group, the aircraft are good, but they don't fit what they are requiring of them, what they are wanting of them. And this is a really interesting thing with the US Navy in that, and Naval Aviation Doctrine development, their wargaming, their theoretical work often outpaces the capabilities of the actual real-world systems they have available. It's often a problem they have to deal with, because they know what they want to do with the aircraft, but what can the aircraft actually do? One of the consistent complaints is that the aircraft don't have long enough range, because they know what they can do at long range, but the trouble is they don't have the range to do that long range. They know they know range is their advantage as an aircraft carrier, as naval aviation. It's the range to be able to hit your target from long way away, to be able to be anywhere, to be able to be anywhere and attack anywhere. That's the advantage of naval aviation. You can literally strike out of nowhere. And so the US Navy is starting already, despite the fact that they have the Douglas DT as their torpedo bomber, a first generation reliable aircraft for first generation, but still first generation torpedo bomber. They have the Bluebird, the Vought V7 Bluebird as their fighter, and Langley as their carrier, and they are still thinking, hang on, what can we do with this, this, and this? How can we do this as naval aviation? What can we build this capability to? And that's the advantage. Because he was made a squadron commander, he was actually allowed to fly a Commodore's Pennant, and Langley, as I said, was his flagship for operations. But the reality was they were already working on what would be coming up. It's kind of like if the Royal Navy had appointed a Rear Admiral aircraft carriers in 1919. Even though they only had HMS Furious and she was sort of sketchy, and they had Campania and Argus, and none of it's really that great. If they'd appointed someone then, this is what the US Navy is doing. So this is one of the reasons why US naval aviation really does grow. The other advantage, though, in terms of developing their doctrine, is this gentleman. And Moffett is where all those strands of naval aviation really do come together. He is the airships guy. He is the long-range maritime patrol guy. He is the guy who's coordinating with Coast Guard. He is arguing with Congress. He is, as the Bureau of Aeronautics, serving as a physical barrier between all those people wanting to develop naval aviation and develop it in the US Navy and the rest of the Navy. If you want to support it, you're allowed through. If you don't want to support it, good luck, you're going to have to fight him. And one of his successors is Ernest J. King, who comes up in this quite a bit as well later on. And let's be honest, neither of these men have an actual reputation for being nice to people who they consider fools, or people who disagree with them and cannot back their arguments up with logic and fact. And for him, wargaming was enough. He was the one who pushes through the US Naval Aviation Observers course. Why does he do that? Well, rather like in Britain, where the observers serve as the way to allow the Royal Navy to grow an aviation-minded force within their Navy, despite not having control of the careers of pilots who are dual-ranked between the Air Force and the Navy, and, trying to work that out. For the US Navy, the observers act as this almost fifth column within the Navy. It allows them to take senior officers who are air-minded but do not have the requisite experience to be able to command a ship like Reeves and commanding Langley, because they can't command a carrier because they haven't been a pilot, and push them through the observer course, where they have to do 100 hours acting as an observer to prove they can do it, and then grandfather them in this beautiful fashion into the aviation branch. So it means that officers who are sufficiently air-minded, have already got the experience, and are already going up the promotion chain, you can nab. And this is how you can start to affect the wider service. This is unlike the IJN, the Royal Navy, those other, and I do keep doing comparisons between the three, because these are the three big carrier air arms. I'm sorry, I know the French have the Burn, but that really doesn't count, as it's one carrier. And 1920s, that don't count as growing a carrier air arm. But the three big fleets who are growing their carrier air arms each have different problems and different advantages. And honestly, the problem for the Royal Navy and the IJN is finding those senior officers and bringing them in to naval aviation. The Royal Navy gets it completely, to an extent, by chance with Henderson and a few others who are definitely not aviators, but who are very, very interested in aviation because of their experience, because of their analysis of the capabilities of aviation, and their own wargaming and reading on the fact. The US Navy has, thanks to the observers course, thanks to the guaranteed appointments of naval air stations, career-minded, capable officers are able to be grandfathered in. It's in their interest to do so by going on that course, by going under the protection of Moffett. And when you're in a service which is as occasionally riven by issues, as the US Navy is by Congress in terms of its desire to whether to fund the people. And let's be honest, if you want a good example of some of the mucking about going on in the US Navy, you need to look no further than Sim's career here. Let's see, he starts off as a midshipman, then he's an ensign junior grade, then finally ensign, lieutenant junior grade, lieutenant commander, commander, captain, rear admiral, selected on 29th of August 1916, but remained number 31 of 30 flag officers, remaining in the rank of captain while waiting a billet until 23rd of March 1917. Then, by 25th of May 1917, has been made a temporary vice admiral. By the 4th of December 1918, has been made an admiral, temporary. And upon return is made back to a rear admiral upon returning, and then retires as a rear admiral. Now, there are reasons for the US Navy being so, but it doesn't help them. It doesn't help them with their senior officers, and it doesn't help them with the officers below that looking to become senior. It really doesn't help them. So you want to be connected with certain bureaus, because certain bureaus are more protective than others. Now, the Bureau of Navigation, they always give the shipping orders, the orders of who's going to command what ship. That's always distributed through them. So if you're associated with them, they usually will look after your career. And that was one of the reasons why they got through these rules made about, your career, your time in service. Because the Bureau of Navigation heavily insisted that you couldn't get a promotion or rank or captain or senior, more senior than that, unless you had enough sea time. Well, someone who's a naval aviator might not get the same level of sea time because they might be in a land-based posting. They might be, even if they are aboard a ship, if they're aboard a carrier, there aren't that many carriers at this point, they might not be actually doing anything to do with the function of the ship because they're concentrated on their air group. And even today we have the scenario where, it could be quite difficult for naval aviators to get promoted if it was entirely based on sea time. Now, there is thankfully a very useful report. This came courtesy of President Coolidge, who had appointed what we now call the Morrow Board. Now, this is called the Morrow Board because 9 members appointed Dwight M. Morrow as their chairman and Arthur C. Dennison as their vice chairman and William F. Durand as secretary. And I'm sure that wasn't selected before they even formed the board. But there had been various reports going backwards and forwards over whether or not aviation was a specific category. In fact, as late as 1925, and this report is convening in 1926, the Bureau of Navigation report had said, aviation is no more specialized as to knowledge required than is submarine or destroyers, and Bureau Nav does not believe that aviation demands of an officer more skill or technical knowledge than is required of a chief engineer or gunnery officer. The manipulative skill required for flying is of no consequence in determining that the officer is fit to hold a higher command in aviation or general line duties, nor does the possession of naval aviator designated by a group of men carry the argument for its perpetuation by medium of a corps. Okay. I realize I come from a nation which refers to its helicopter pilots occasionally as cab drivers, depending on their function, or bus drivers, again. But even I think that's pushing it a little bit. But there again, there are some of those included in that which I would suggest do require their own specialist skill set protections. As it was, the Morrow Board, which was convened and received 99 witnesses, half of which were flying personnel, and was heavily influenced, I would say, by the work of Moffat, with all his political connections. And you must remember, by this point, he'd been chief of the Bureau of Aeronautics from 1921, so it's pretty much 5 years. And the Bureau of Navigation, in many ways, their report, to try and render it moot, was in many ways an attack on this upstart bureau which was causing them trouble, because they'd had unprecedented control over the promotions of naval officers and the posting of naval officers up until this point, and suddenly there's another bureau which has a section of naval officers under their command and their promotions and their listings, and that is a threat to the Bureau of Navigation's power. Although I'm sure that didn't have any impact on their report. I'm sure it didn't. Anyway, the Murrah Board decided that carrying as extra numbers aviators who had specialised in aviation so long as to jeopardise their chance of promotion by selection to commander, captain or rear admiral. Granting temporary higher rank to junior officers assigned to aviation duty whenever high rank was appropriate. Maintaining flight pay as then provided whilst investigating a scheme of insurance. Confining selections for command of aviation officer activities to officers who, while otherwise qualified, were also naval aviators. That's carriers, naval air stations. Disassociating from naval aviators, aviation aviators assigned to general line duty for purposes of qualification for command to the minimum extent. Ensuring the junior officers who had not had the required sea duty have that duty before being examined for promotion, and studying the desirability of increasing the number of enlisted pilots in naval aviation. Eventually, even the US House of Representatives has to get involved, and the House Naval Affairs Committee actually had to legislate and propose the first legal definition of naval aviator. Any commissioned officer or warrant line officer in the Navy or Marine Corps who has successfully completed the course prescribed by competent authority for naval aviators, and who has been or may hereafter be designated or appointed naval aviator by competent authority, and who has flown alone in a heavier than air aircraft not less than 75 hours, and has flown in heavier than aircraft not less than 200 hours, or who has been in the air under training in rigid airships not less than 150 hours and successfully completed the course prescribed by competent authority. And, well, that then leads to all sorts of fun. But all that comes down to this, man. And what does that all have to do with doctrine? Because it must feel like I've wandered off the plot a bit, you know. I'm talking about it. Because if you want to create a doctrine, if you want to envelop a doctrine and build a doctrine into your fleet, you need to be able to build your officers into the fabric of that fleet, which means they need to be part of the promotions. If you want that doctrine to interweave, and this is the thing, as time goes on, it becomes more and more clear that aircraft are a critical part. Yes, do they have the hitting power of battleships at this point? No. Do they have the reliability of battleships at this point? No. They're certainly not all weather capable killers. But they have a rapid development on their side. A rapid pace of technology change, because the technology is not mature. In many ways, the 1920s and 30s are aviation going through its teenage years. You have a lot of potential there. You have a lot of options. But as anyone who's ever taught teenagers will know, they can go any different ways. And you try and guide them. You try and do your best. But you can't foresee their outcome. That's up to them. And with naval aviation and aviation as a general thing, it was hoped for, but no one knew what obstacles it was going to come up against. No one knew what it was going to be. They had war games, which were giving them a theory. And you had people like Moffat, who supported them, who were giving them the coverage and the political support necessary to be able to develop that and have the time to develop that. And to have officers like Reeves able to push it through. And the dive bombing discussion earlier, again, to refer back to it, comes from Reeves stating problems. Reeves believing that you had to turn every carrier, every naval aviation station into a school. Because first you had to learn the realities of naval aviation, its advantages and disadvantages, before you could promulgate naval aviation, before you could use it. And this is very much what they spend the 1920s and the early and mid-1920s doing. a school. And then these two fine universities come into service. Are they, again, what Sims really wanted? Not quite there. They really aren't. But they are a good starting point. And they allow you to produce a huge number of aircraft for them and allow you to operate with all the freedom a battlecruiser hull has enabled you to. Yes, Lexington and Saratoga are gorgeous. Lexington and Saratoga only exist probably due to the Washington Naval Treaty. Otherwise, I'm fairly certain they'd have either been scrapped or built as battlecruisers. I do not think they'd have been built as an aircraft carrier without the treaty. And as a whole, these ships are where the US Navy really starts to, with the fleet problems they can embrace with them and Langley, for a short time, she's included as well, they can really start to develop their ideas of what they need to do aviation-wise, of how the fleet needs to work. And it's these ships which start to produce the carrier task forces. And what's really interesting is the US Navy and the Royal Navy come to a similar sort of conclusion at the same time. The IJN is slightly slower. The IJN is very much going for the massed whole fleet approach, and that's where the Kido Batai comes in. The Royal Navy and US Navy both sort of come up with the task force ideas, but the interesting thing is the Royal Navy, with its battle cruisers and its fast capital ships, is always looking at the carrier battle cruiser joint task force, the fast task force as a joint formation. The US Navy, without those fast capital ships, looks at the carriers as the linchpin of a fast formation based on them, and a task force task group formation based on them. And that's a really interesting differential, and also explains some of the different points at which they're thinking of. It's also very interesting to think through that, in many extents, the US Navy, despite the often theorized fear of Hood and all these things, spends far more time in its aircraft carrier doctrine looking at raids and looking at raiding operations and carrying out raiding operations on many exercises on Panama Canal, on Hawaii, on all sorts of key installations, and less at dealing with surface raiders. It's the inverse in many ways of the Royal Navy. Although, saying that, the Royal Navy does spend quite a lot of time looking at mapping out certain harbours in the world and working out how it's going to hit them if the ships are hissing in them. So they both have their little sort of peccadillos. Royal Navy's is constantly, we will never have a fleet hiding in harbour from us again, and the US Navy's is, we want to work out how to dominate the world. We are coming of age. One's about preservation of power and status, the other one's about growing into it. And that's shown in their roles and their exercises. But these two aircraft carriers, when they come into service, and please note I've used the commissioning dates, because launching dates are what matter from the age of the ship. But for our purposes, in terms of development of naval aviation, what matters is when the ship's commissioned. It's commissioned in 1922, and Reeves gets appointed as the captain of the system in 1925. Lexington, Saratoga, they are 1927. That's when they're commissioned. This is what matters for us, because the moment they're commissioned is the moment they start being heavily included in exercises, and they become linchpins of exercises. And the US Navy does all sorts of things with their fleet problems. Sometimes they are one side, sometimes they're split up and on either side fighting each other. Sometimes they are the entire enemy fleet. Sometimes they're the entire representative of the American fleet. Now, one of those interesting things with all these fleet exercises to think about is that the linchpin war game that you always play in this period when you're graduating as the final war game at Naval War College, it's called the Battle of Sable Island. And it's basically the US Navy versus the Royal Navy. That's their linchpin war game, because that is the biggest and biggest fight they can possibly imagine. At this period, it makes sense in the treaty era, and that's often used the reason of, oh yeah, they were preparing for war against each other. Well, no, think about it from the point of view you want to do a graduating ceremony and final test of all the skills you've been teaching your officers at Naval War College. Who are you going to pick for them to fight? It's going to be the biggest potential threat you can think of, and the only potential threat that's as big as the U.S. Navy at this point, or rather bigger, thanks to the Congress never funding them enough, is the Royal Navy. I know, by treaty they're equal. By Congress funding, the Royal Navy's bigger. That's a whole other discussion and a whole other debate. But when you look at these exercises, it's often Blue Fleet versus Black Fleet. Black Fleet is often synonymous with the Japanese, and it's looking at the war. So the physical exercises, the real-world exercises, are often focused on fighting a Japanese threat. And they correctly perceive the carrier capabilities of Japan quite early on, and carrier inclination of Japan. They also do some really interesting, and we'll be getting into those in a bit, attacks on Pearl Harbor. Because naval aviation in this period for the US Navy is really developing around, I would call, a battle doctrine and a raiding doctrine. Battle doctrine is how to fight a battle. That's easy. It comes back to Sims. The Sims idea of hitting your enemy carrier first because that will win the battle, and getting the most aircraft off the quickest is how you win a battle. And there are many, many exercises which prove that time and time again. But one of the things you should notice about those exercises is they rarely involve the concept of what happens if you're operating in close proximity to large land bases which you can't sink. And that's when the differential starts to come in, as Norman Freeman points in later in the book when he's talking about the illustrious class armoured hangar carriers. The other doctrine that's coming in, the other key point, is a raiding doctrine. How can we use our carriers to reach out and touch the enemy, to reach out and disrupt the enemy, to reach out and cause the enemy dilemmas? You see, what they noticed quite quickly, and this is one of the reasons why Sims and Reeves and other officers involved in developing the earlier doctrines, and that'll be the foundational doctrines of naval aviation for the US Navy, are really working around, is that aircraft carriers can, with very little effort, strike very far apart. Because let's say your aircraft have a strike range of 200 nautical miles. And I launch a strike from where I am 200 miles away to hit you. I recover the strike. 12 hours later, I launch another strike. But in that time, I've moved maybe 240 nautical miles as well. So I could be within the space of 14, 15 hours. Within a day, I could be striking targets 600, 700 nautical miles apart. That is a dilemma. The definition of a dilemma in military phraseology is giving your opponent two or more options which are all equally bad. Where do I put my defensive forces if I can't see you, and you can strike this target and then be striking another target 700 plus nautical miles away within the space of a day? How do I counter that? Now, the answer is I need lots of forces to counter it. I need lots of land-based maritime patrol aircraft. I need lots of, well, today, satellites and SOSUS lines and all sorts of things to try and listen out for this. But it's still a huge task. Because, honestly, the Americans have kept pushing this doctrine, and a fair number of other nations have pushed into it. One interesting thing is, again, if you look at the strike doctrine, this is the comparison I tend to draw is with the British, again, because the British have the night strike doctrine, the long-range night strike doctrine. The Americans have what I call the raiding strike doctrine of hit here, move, hit here. And that's all about rapid generation of alpha strikes of these big formations, but also having the space to maneuver. And this is where you see a lot of the geographical realities of the spaces they're looking at operating in. You know, whether you're looking at operating the wide Pacific or the South China Sea, the Mediterranean Sea, the North Atlantic, all these different operations of where you are thinking about operating your fleet and how that's going to change your adaptations and some of your doctrinal points. One of the things is that I want to emphasize is that it's not any easier today to try and deal with this dilemma because yes, we have satellites, we have all those things I mentioned, but the aircraft have improved, have got better from the carriers. The carriers have got faster. That 200 miles was based on a 20 knot speed of progress. Modern carriers can do faster than that. So that is one of the realities you also have to deal with as a potential opponent. Your enemy carrier could hit you here, and then by the time you're reorienting to defend, because you think they're coming from that way, they're now down there and hitting you down there. And the whole time, what you don't realise is their real target is they're drawing you off to the sides to hit you here in the centre. And this is what the US Navy is working through the idea of in this period. They really are. Which always makes Sable Island, to me, a really interesting concept for them to be focusing on for the Naval Warfare College. Because whilst it makes sense from a battle against Britain perspective, it is rather a pure battle in its analysis. And yes, they do try and broaden it out and do have raiding, etc. But its positioning off the coast of Canada, etc., it rather limits you to, yes, this is where the British fleet have come in. They're coming down, we're going up to fight them, sort of thing. It's rather Jutland-esque for what was a navy which was thinking through a lot of doctrines. But there again, it was the biggest, scariest battle they could imagine against the only peer threat they had, potential peer threat they had. And please note, I'm saying potential peer threat. The thing is, Britain and America aren't allies in this period, but they also aren't likely to become enemies. There's often discussions put over naval race and all these things. Well, they'd been a qualitative race for a long time, and it had never led them to a war scenario. They're not even frenemies. They have largely resolved the vast majority of their issues between each other that could have potentially led to conflict. Unless you got a radical change of government that decided they were going to actively invade the other one or the other on either side, it was not going to start a war. And you don't go to war over having, oh, you have a fancier battleship than me. No, you build a fancier battleship. That's what happens. That's the thing about a qualitative versus a quantitative race. And again, when we talk about, people often point to the American build-up at the end of World War One and go, look, that shows a quantitative race. Well, no, look on the other side. How many 15-inch gun battleships do the Royal Navy have? And generationally, the 16-inch gun are the US Navy's equivalent. So basically, the Royal Navy's built. At one point, you know, they've got the 5 Queen Elizabeth service, the 5 R's, Renown, Repulse, and Hood. So they got 13 15-inch gun battleships in service. And battle cruisers, 3 battle cruisers. Well, 10 battleships and 3 battle cruisers. As far as the US Navy is concerned, though, before the Lexingtons, they weren't building anything like was a battle cruiser. So they're lumping them all in together. Their response makes perfect sense. It's not a quantitative race. It's a matchup, and we consider what actually comes into service for the US Navy is 3 16-inch gun ships. You're going to have to do a lot of work to persuade me that in a scenario where the British are already building the G3s and N3s, that the Americans were in any way building aggressively against the British, and the British were aggressively building against the Americans. They weren't. It was qualitative race competition. Standard rules. But all that competition did leave the Americans at the basis of what became the Lexington and Saratoga, which, as said, are the universities of their naval aviation. They're where they really do start to develop. Now, we'll start talking about postgraduate schools in a bit, but at this point, Langley has been the school. It's been the college and the school of aviation they've had to develop themselves up through. Now they're into university. Now they are starting to think of, hang on, how do we really do this? We've learned all the questions we need to ask, and this was the really interesting thing when we get into Reeves, is the questions he seeks to ask, and he seeks to answer, and the fact that Reeves, as taught by the pattern of Sims, although he hadn't been taught specifically by Sims, as far as I can work out, but he definitely taught by people who Sims are taught, is prepared to say, I don't know the answer to these questions. And that's always an incredibly powerful tool for development of doctrine. When the senior officer in the room, the one in charge, turns around and goes, we have these questions we have to answer, and I don't know them either. That allows people to start thinking, because the moment you have that, the moment senior officers admit that, they've said the equivalent of, there is no right answer. Because if you're a career-minded soul, or someone who doesn't like to have arguments with your seniors, well, you're probably going to think if the Admiral has an answer, then you're going to have to follow that answer, whether you like it or not. An Admiral saying they have no answer. An Admiral saying, I have these questions. I don't know the answer to. Let's go develop them. Let's go find out the answer together. That's liberating. And that's a really important thing, and I say a lesson for modern leadership today. You can tell good leaders from bad leaders. Because a good leader will often say things like, I don't have the answer, let's find it out. These are the questions. Let's go answer them. They won't say, it's my way or the highway. Because, and I think the really powerful tool of this, especially in naval aviation this period, is it is developing so quickly, things are changing so quickly, that the answer today to that question might not be the answer tomorrow. And this is again a thing the US Naval Aviation was grappling with, because they were coming up with a doctrine which was evolving as the technology was evolving, but also as their situation was evolving. One of the things that comes out of a lot of the exercises with Lexington and Saratoga, and this is especially true in Reeves' opinion, but also in Pratt's, and Pratt's goes on to become commander of the battle fleet, commander of the US Navy fleet. He's a very senior officer, and he's less well known in terms of development of naval aviation because, as capable as he is, and as useful as he is as Chief of Naval Operations in 1930 to 1933, his contributions often get diminished by the fact he was wrestling with the Depression. He was wrestling with that. His one big success was managing to prevent Roosevelt combining the Navy into the Coast Guard as one organization. Roosevelt actually was considering it. He believed that it was possible. And, yeah, I have just corrected Pratt's name up there. I noticed it was a mistake. It's spelled it right down here, but wrong up there. It's a double T. But the real problem with that combination of naval aviation is that you would have had both, well, probably the Navy would have swamped the Coast Guard, and a lot of the search patterns which they use for their long-range maritime patrol and their doctrine develops would just not have happened. Because those search patterns are developed for finding things like missing ships. And the US Navy are thinking about search patterns for finding fleets. And when you're hunting submarines, which is it closer to? Finding a fleet or a missing ship? Is it finding a convoy and a group of ships, or a needle in a haystack? Coast Guard's pattern, some of their development patterns and their works really does help. And that probably wouldn't have happened if you combined the two organizations, because of the different emphasis. One of the other interesting things, and the thing I often use to illustrate the changing answers, when Reeves here is captain of naval aviation for the battle fleet and is coordinating with Langley. You can launch fighters quickly enough to intercept an incoming attack. You can see them visually. You can launch your fighters, launch as large a number of fighters as you can from deck, and intercept them. By the time we're in the mid 1930s, you are dealing with the issues of how do you stop that. Now, the U.S. Navy's plan is to find the enemy carrier first and sink it, and there are exercises where they do this, and that is very much a possibility. But this is also where you get the classic difference and where people start trying to go right or wrong with other doctrines. Because if the US Navy doctrine had been adopted by the British in the Mediterranean and the South China Sea, where there was likely to be a large number of land air bases, and there are all sorts of threats from that perspective, as, you know, the British are becoming that, the British would have lost ships. Because you can't sink an airbase. As I've made many jokes and quips over the years, Warspite kept trying and kept trying to figure it out as the 15-inch Queen Elizabeth class battleship, but she never came up with it, and even her friend the USS Texas didn't manage to solve that particular problem. They both put a lot of study into it. I'm sure Texas still has her notes, but there's a difference. If you'd gone with the British methodology for the Americans and the British focus for the Americans, their carriers would have been more survivable, but would they have necessarily been able to generate the strikes that they wanted to? And the reality is you can't produce a combined carrier because both are labouring under the treaties. And one of the interesting things is they keep coming up against treaty problems. And it's how they deal that. Pratt is trying to approach that. Reeves is trying to approach that because they keep coming to the scenario of, we don't need 2 Lexingtons. We need 6 to 8 carriers available, which are like the Lexington class, to have enough carriers to generate it. And you cannot do that under the treaty cumulative tonnage limitations. This is why you get such a change post 1937 in procurement orders, because the cumulative limits on capital ships and on carrier numbers and cruiser numbers all go. You have individual ship limits, but no cumulative limits anymore. Which is probably the worst scenario for a naval treaty system you could actually get. You either, cumulative limits are terrible. They really are. They stop anyone being able to adjust anything. But individual ship tonnage limitations means you can't do necessarily what you want to do. And so that's why the first generation of carriers, where you're really dealing with them post-treaty era, and they are not rapid designs, still based on the concept of the treaty era, you're dealing with are not the illustrious class, are not, for the Americans, even the Essexes. We're talking about the Midways and the Implacables. They are the post-treaty carrier designs, and they're the genesis of what comes up. Because honestly, the navies, if you had them together, the US Navy would like their individual carriers to be a bit more survivable, and that's also a reason why they keep talking about small carriers. But as I said before, the US Navy doesn't like small carriers in the interwar period. They don't generate enough aircraft. They don't generate enough strikes. They're not efficient enough for their operations. And every time they look at them as a means of multiplying the decks they're operating off, they come back to the same problem. Ultimately, this is not going to be efficient. It's not going to carry enough aircraft. And once you're looking at wanting to carry enough aircraft, what is enough aircraft? Well, Langley was felt to be too small with 48. So you're looking at 72 minimum aircraft. That's not going to be a small carrier. And yes, in wartime, they do end up making use of the Woolworths carriers, as they're often called in the UK, the escort carrier. And people then point to that and go, well, they obviously do like small carriers because they use all these. In wartime, they're using whatever they can get to maximize the naval aviation capabilities they can have, and to reduce the strain on their fleet so they can have their fleet doing what they need their big fleet carriers to do. Because if you don't have all the little carriers in service, then you have to send your big carriers. And they'll take whatever they can get and whatever they can produce as quickly as they can. Doesn't mean they want it or like it, it's mean they have it to use it. There's a difference. It doesn't come from their doctrine. It comes from necessity. And that is something we often have to think about when we're evaluating ships and systems. It's sort of, is this ship from the doctrine, or is it from necessity or politics? Those are usually the three factors which will define a ship. Is it a product of politics, is it a product of necessity, or is it a product of doctrine? And navies have to fuse all of them together, and they have to find a way of often making the last two, the politics ships and necessity ships, fit within their doctrine and operate within their doctrine, and that's often where they have problems. So, the US Navy at this point, doctrinally, is already really pushing towards the carrier task forces, but already really finding that, A, they need cruisers very different from the cruisers they have to be part of these carrier forces, because they've gone for reconnaissance cruisers and scout cruisers, and they're fast and they've got 8-inch guns, but they're not what they need to defend the task group, and they need different destroyers for this job as well. One of the things they start to realise with carriers is the strategic mobility they have depends in many ways of you being able to escort them with forces, and they start to look at what the British are doing in this period as well. They are, in the late 1920s, they're starting to look at the British. They're looking at what the British are doing, Courageous and Glorious especially. And they're looking at them teaming up with things like Hood, Renown, and Repulse, and doing those operations. And they both observe each other's exercises. And the Japanese are always invited, but don't usually reciprocate because they don't like people coming to observe their exercises. And the Americans are... That's the one time at which I think there are American officers who are missing the Lexington-class battlecruisers. When they're looking at it going, that solves so many of your problems, being able to have one of those wandering off together as a task force. If you're sending it out as a task force, it goes out in that scenario with that carrier. And this is the other thing, the USS Ranger. Now, this is a product of the US Navy going, we want a large air group. Okay, this is a small carrier in terms of tonnage, but it's a large air group. And they're trying to shovel that onto this, and she has the compromises which fit with that. And this is what I mean about the US Navy not liking small carriers. She might be smaller in tonnage in comparison to the Lexington, the Saratogas, the Yorktowns, all those. But she's big in air group, and she's designed around operating that air group in comparison. She is 15,000 tons in standard, less than. She's 14,810 tons in 810 tons in standard. And her theoretical maximum aircraft is 86. Normally she carries roughly 70. She is designed to be as big an air group as they can get, on as smaller hull as they can get, because again, they are wrestling with that cumulative tonnage limitation. The wooden flight deck was at least easily repairable, but it was really not that helpful in so many other ways. And they had outriggers, they had everything they could to maximize the number of aircraft they could carry on her. But she comes into service, and almost immediately the US Navy is going, this is not something we want to go into high-intensity combat. This is not something we want in heavy combat operations. This is something we want to keep back. And I think when Admiral Ernest J. King would rather go to the British and ask to borrow HMS Victorious, aka USS Robin for that particular exercise, to serve in the Pacific Fleet and assist them out, than deploy her. King, the famous Anglophobe, just as Sims was accused of being an Anglophile, and really wasn't as much of an Anglophile as is often perceived as being, King is not really as much of an Anglophobe as he is really had a bad experience with Admiral Beatty and developed a bad impression of the British Admiralty because of that. He basically reserved his judgment when he met individual admirals. There was some he quite liked. Noble he eventually got on with. Somerville he really quite enjoyed the company of. But the thing is, King he's very proud of America and doesn't like to ask anyone for help from America. He avoids asking for help and advice over convoying issue and anti-submarine warfare operations on the East Coast, despite that being a problem which almost cost him his position And yet on this, and we're talking about a man who has been a carrier commander and who has also been chief of the Bureau of Aeronautics. If he is so anti the concept of sending range to the Pacific, she's not used in anything like a high threat environment in the European theatre either. You have to wonder. But she was an attempt to try and meet the doctrine under the political requirements of the treaty. And that's where her problem lies. And it's the same with WASP later on. They are an attempt to meet the obligations and ideas and requirements of the doctrine, whilst also fulfilling the obligations and requirements of the politics of the treaty. And the treaties I'm talking about are the Washington Naval Treaty and then the first London Naval Treaty, because they have the cumulative limits for aircraft carriers and capital ships. And first London Treaty, of course, introduces cumulative limits for destroyers and cruisers and submarines and pretty much everything they can get their hands on. And speaking about King, well, he comes up at this point because he starts to be really, really important to the history of naval aviation and doctrine. He is taught many lessons by Reeves. One of the interesting things is at the point that Reeves is in charge of the carriers, he would base himself from Saratoga. And he did several exercises, and there's Fleet Problem 12, but I would say the subsequent special maneuvers are really a more interesting development in terms of carrier doctrine. Because what he would do was, this was while King was the captain of Lexington. He'd send Lexington off with half the forces. And he'd make Captain King not only commander of Lexington, but also Lexington Task Group commander. Now, there's always some fun here at this point. I'm differentiating, okay? At this point, they would often say it was just a task force, because they're in the task force doctrine. Modern task force doctrine has a task force at this level, and then that'd be broken up into task groups. So if we're talking about the Falklands War, you have the carrier battle group, you have the amphibious task group. Okay? You would also have the submarine operations. And you'd have the South Atlantic Task Force, and they're under command, all commanded back from northward. And that's where the task force commander was. Well, in this scenario, what you've got, realistically, is a carrier task force. And then, around each carrier, you have a task group. But, because with them dividing off, we're going to make these both task forces for this operation. Which makes sense, but also needs to be differentiated, because they operate together quite a lot. Now, the interesting thing about Fleet Problem 12, is how do you defend the Panama Canal from the Pacific side by an attack from a force which has limited aviation assets, but all you have is aviation assets. Now, interesting enough, in the exercise, they do really well, the aviation assets of the Blue Fleet, which is the defenders. And they do manage to cover and spot the enemy, and they keep them under consistent air attack. But the enemy do manage to affect their landings, and whilst they're under constant air attack, they are landing and carrying out operations. So they get in, but they have been under attack. And this, of course, is done in 1931. But after the February 1931 Fleet Problem 12, they have some other fun. And this other fun is the special exercises conducted between Lexington and Saratoga's task groups. Now, I'm going to read this out because this is in a chapter in this book written by Albert A. Nuffy. It's Aviation Interwar Fleet Maneuvers, 1919 to 1940. And I could put this in my own words, and I will give you my own analysis, but you might have noticed I have been referencing and reading from the book specifically where it is relevant. That's basically my version of giving you a citation. actually showing you where I'm getting the information from and where you can go and find out more. Because the thing I love about U.S. Naval Aviation Doctrine is there is so much written about it. There are so many books to go and go through. This is a good one. There's also the Sims book, and there's many other books to message with, including one about Pete Ellis, which is all fun. It's all fun. Pete Ellis, Amphibious Warfare Prophet. And yes, that has stuff to do with naval aviation in there, and the US Marine Corps' approach to naval aviation. So, after Lexington had a day's head start to lose herself in the Caribbean, the maneuvers began well before dawn on 22nd of March. With Saratoga about 150 miles east of Colon, Reeves, considering King's options, concluded that Lexington was most likely northeast of Colon and sent a destroyer in that direction, calculating that the aggressive King would be unable to resist the bait. He then positioned Saratoga in Eglon behind a destroyer. Reeves' estimate was exactly correct. Lexington scouts found a destroyer soon after dawn on 22nd. King ordered a major airstrike to trace the destroyer's course back to Saratoga. Meanwhile, a Saratoga scout had already located Lexington. Reeves put a large strike in the air and ordered some cruisers towards the enemy carrier. As Lexington's aircraft looked for Saratoga, 70 Saratoga aircraft sank their carrier, aided by the cruisers that arrived during the action. From the time Saratoga's strike was launched until Lexington was sunk, little more than an hour passed. While this underscored the importance of getting in the first blow, the loss of Lexington led to some calls for small carriers and flying deck cruisers to avoid losing too many aircraft with a single ship. A recommendation that went nowhere, because people immediately pointed out, well, how many aircraft can you carry? And the thing is, the things you need to make a carrier work, they are heavy. And there's a lot of components which are one-off components. A pumping system. Well, it doesn't matter whether you have lots of tanks, one big massive tank, or a small tank. You still need the same pumping system to achieve the same pressure, broadly speaking. It might get a little bit bigger, but the pump itself is going to be a presence and a fixed system you're going to need to invest in weight in. So the bigger carrier has a slightly heavier pump, but in terms of tonnage, that's actually taking up a far less percentage of the whole overall vessel's tonnage. And there are lots of other systems which devolve into this. Naval aviation is fun. King is important because he fights the battles for naval aviation. He does as a rear admiral in charge of carrier groups, as Rear Admiral, Bureau of Aeronautics, where he worked with Admiral Leahy, who was in charge of the Bureau of Navigation at that point, to sort out a lot of issues between the two organisations and try and increase the number of naval aviators. But realistically, I would say King's greatest contribution is as head of the Commander Aircraft Battle Force, which he's one of the 3 Vice Admiral billets that the US Navy had at the time, and he gets this in January 1938. And he remembers something which others didn't, because on the 7th of February, 1932, at that point, Admiral Yarnell, who'd been in charge of the Lexington Saratoga, had been in charge of the forces, had done taken part in a war game where he had surprised on Sunday, the 7th of February, 1932, Hawaii, and overwhelmed the air defenses, overwhelmed the base, everything, on a Sunday morning. And this is completely forgotten. Well, it's not forgotten by King. And in 1938, he does his own air raid on Pearl Harbor. So next time someone tells you that no one knew that Pearl Harbor was weak, or that they were at risk, they've done it themselves. All the admirals knew this. Kimmel, all of them knew it. And all of them were asking for defenses, and all of them were trying to work with an imperfect information load. And one of the fun things that comes out when you start looking at this particular period and King and Kimmel and all the others, one of the critiques that comes from Kimmel is that he was not using his long-range maritime patrol aircraft, his Catalinas, like he should be. He was stockpiling for a war. He didn't have enough supplies forward in Pearl Harbor to keep them at the pitch they need, keep them at the capabilities they need to be, and also have them available for warfighting. Because Pearl Harbor was very much a forward base. It didn't have the supplies, didn't have the facilities set up there to sustain these things. Wasn't getting the supplies and facility stuff they needed to. So he actually had to make a choice, and people sometimes go, "Oh, he should have been operating his aircraft." Well, if he'd operated his aircraft and then war happened and it wasn't a strike on Pearl Harbor, he wouldn't have had those aircraft available to help with his maneuvers. He needed the long-range maritime patrol aircraft as part of their scanning group, because it's very important that you use ship aircraft like that to further the reach of US naval aviation. There is a lot of intermixing of the connected roles between long-range maritime patrol aircraft and the carrier naval doctrine. Truly, it comes down to reconnaissance and strategic and theatre situational awareness. But the thing is, for that to work, you need to have those aircraft available. It's the scenario I often come to that one is when Kimmel is making that decision, and people tell him use his making that decision as an example of him doing something bad. A, he was talking with other admirals at the time about making that decision, and B, the scenario that's bad here is that he's been forced into making that decision in the first place. There is no scenario where the commander of US forces in the Pacific should honestly be making a decision between, do I operate these aircraft now, or do I save them for wartime because I don't have enough spare parts and systems to sustain them? Because that is a classic military dilemma. You have the government has literally forced one of their commanders into a dilemma where there is no good choice. Yes, turns out when Pearl Harbor happened, he would have been considered right to have done that thing, because he would have probably had some notification that there were carriers nearby, hopefully with the patrols going around. But if the attack had been on the Philippines, the patrols going around would have worn those aircraft down, and he'd gone, I can't reinforce the Philippines because I can't surge forward my long-range reconnaissance assets. I'm going to have to rely on my carriers to do it, which is not as safe. Because we can cover a far wider area if we can move forward things like USS Langley at this point, seaplane bases, to support the seaplanes operating out of certain atolls and small islands, and provide overwatch over our flanks as we maneuver forward, so the enemy can't disrupt our supply lines and can't attack us from angles we're not expecting. Again, the reality is doctrine does not develop in a vacuum, and this is the important point when we go back to wargaming. The Americans have a very good idea of what the likely best strategies for the Japanese are. They realize attrition warfare, which is a key component of Japanese strategy. I talked about this a lot in the Kantai Kessen, more than just the Kantai Kessen video, and I'll probably put a link up to Tsingtao Naval Air War, because that video goes into it also in quite a lot of details, and that's an alternate history, but it's an interesting one from Patreon question. And the Japanese actually have a phrase of this called Yugeki Senken Sakusen, interception and attrition operations. And that was a key part of their war plan. People often focus in on the Kantai Kessen, the decisive battle, and again, everyone realizes that's part of the Japanese strategy because that's the Battle of Tsushima. This is what the Japanese seek. But they have a lot of things which come before the Kantai Kessen as the phase of operations and what their plan is and doctrines for it. And the Americans work out early on, thanks to their wargaming, that the likely Japanese doctrine is to try and draw them into the West Pacific, to try and draw them over there quickly, trick them on the way, especially of things like their aircraft carriers and their reconnaissance assets, and then, once they've blinded them, destroy them. Things like your long-range maritime patrol aircraft and your carriers, and this is king, is really proving this in the 1938 exercises, but this has been proved repeatedly in multiple fleet problems, are critical assets to avoiding that, to providing with the information, because the best way to fight attrition operations is to A, move with to some caution, but B, have reconnaissance assets up covering your area, covering the wider area, spotting what the enemy is doing before they can do it. So you have a picture of them. And all these operations, all these events, all these battles are feeding into the doctrine which is developing their carriers. And this is where we get the Yorktown class. Now, again, they are under treaty limitations. They are under treaty limitations. So they are not a pure expression of US Naval Aviation Doctrine. They are not. They are as close as you can get under the treaty limitations they have. And these are the first large fleet carriers built from the keel up as carriers for the US Navy. These ships are also some of the best carrier designs ever created for any period, okay? And again, please note the context and nuance of when I say this, because I would also not put these ships in service with the Royal Navy for its needs, because they wouldn't fit it. Realistically, what you have to do when evaluating any ship is always evaluate it against the needs of the nation that's built it, and their strategic needs, and their doctrine. Yorktown Enterprise, the reason they are so good for the US Navy when they want to do the operations they want to do, when they want to do the raiding, when they want to do the battles, when they want to fight the way they want to fight, it's because these fit it to a T. This is why they're such a good design. They fit the doctrine and need of the US Navy to a T, or as close as they can within that treaty limitation. Why do I say this? Why do I say these fit it to a T? Well, they have a hangar level catapult, which can theoretically help them get fighters out quickly if there's an enemy attack coming in. They have 2 catapults on the main deck to help them launch their strikes. They have 3 lifts, 3 elevators, which are helping aircraft get up and down. They are everything designed around launching that big strike, launching those large number of aircraft as quickly as physically possible. These carriers are fast, they are long-ranged, they are incredibly spacious for aircraft maintenance and support, and they are designed around sustaining that large air group to operate at peak efficiency and launch that massive strike as quickly as they possibly can. And launch, if they need to, they can be arranging the strike up on deck, and they can launch the fighters from the hangar level, catapult level, if they need to, so they don't have to disrupt launching that strike. Same idea which has gone into the multiple levels of flying off decks on some of the Japanese carriers and the British carriers at times when they try this. It's the same idea. Americans have pushed it forward and have put in that catapult and have gone, yeah, because in the pre-radar period, that's what you were going to need. By the time they come into service, radar's available. And that makes a big difference to these ships. But they are truly built around the concepts and doctrine of the US Naval Aviation. The idea that you find your enemy first, you strike your enemy first, because a sunk enemy carrier is the best air defense you can have for your own carrier and therefore your own fleet. And that's the critical component. And once you've done that, you can then use your aircraft for the other missions to take out enemy ships, to harry them, to make the space safe for your battle fleet to do its job. Because for much of this period, the battle fleet is as much part of the doctrine as the carrier. Now, if we go back to that exercise of Reeves versus King, what did he do? He had the airstrike going in to sink them, but he also had cruisers arriving rapidly after that airstrike. Admittedly, that's possible because of the ranges involved, but still, it is a critical part of it. And it's a critical part of the development of the US Naval Aviation. And these carriers epitomize the product of those problems, and their examinations of fleet problems 12 to 15, which were, of course, critical ones with Lexington and Saratoga, really showing off their skills and capabilities in them. And fleet problems 12 to 15 can be categorized in many ways. But as already discussed, fleet problem 12 was about defending the Panama Canal with Saratoga and Lexington. They provided the strength of it. And then fleet problem 13, well, that took place after the Grand Joint Exercise Number 4, which was, of course, the Hawaii fun, where Yarnell showed that Hawaii could be attacked. So that takes place in March 1932. And on this scenario, you have, basically, fleets based in Hawaii and fleets based in America, and they are trying to fight each other. Blue Fleet had 9 battleships and 1 aircraft carrier. Black defended with 1 modern aircraft carrier and some fictional battleships. The US Navy is great at doing the fictional battleships thing. Remember again our good friends from earlier? They're rather cute, so I feel we should go back to them. The first ever exercise aircraft carriers for the US Navy. I am talking, of course, of the well-known aircraft carriers New York and Oklahoma. You can really see from their lines, their deck, their structuring, they are all about the aircraft. But the whole point, the fleet problems keep building on each other, and the number of fleet problems which take place out of Hawaii, because they are trying to move the fleet to Hawaii and trying to develop that. And Fleet Problem 15, or XV, is a massive free-phase exercise taking place in 1934. And it encompassed attacks and defense of the Panama Canal, the capture of advanced bases, a full fleet engagement. And this is then built up into, of course, the May 1935 Fleet Problem 16, XVI. And this is really a point we need to come to now. Because it's this exercise which is so big, it's almost seen as a provocation by Japan. Because the Americans have got so obsessed with growing their exercises to be as big as they can, Japan's going, oh, they are massing a battle fleet for us. And there's the fact it took place between Alaska and the Hawaiian Islands. So it's getting further and further across the Pacific. And it's getting more and more realistic. There's 5 phases. And it's entirely modelling the War Plan Orange and its plans for war. There is a point at which your exercises get so realistic, your opponents are actually looking and going, hey, that's quite obviously targeted at me, as if you're preparing for war against me. And that's when you get into small problems and start going, actually, have we maybe provoked them a bit with that? You always have to have at least some level of fiction with your exercises. Britain doesn't bother with fiction. Britain just has wars between Devon and Cornwall because it's well known that that's likely to break out at any moment. There's only a small river between them, Tamar, and it doesn't cover the full border. It's always a possibility, so, you know. But it's an internal war, so we don't have to worry about upsetting any of our neighbours when we practice this war. Every Thursday. Every Thursday of every week we practice that war. But with the fleet problems, they had grown that big. But also they'd grown to prove the needs of the carriers that well. The more you did the exercises, the more you checked your doctrine with increasingly realistic exercises, the more you proved this doctrine. And that's what leads to these carriers, what leads to the Yorktown class, and what leads to a lot of the work that's put into them and development of the next generation of US naval aviation, US Navy carriers. And the fact is, these carriers are started under the first London Naval Treaty, and sort of with that sort of heritage. Yes, they're commissioned in 37, 38, and that's when you've now got the second London Naval Treaty in service. But let's be honest, the second London Naval Treaty is about isn't worth the paper it's written on, and is very quickly overruled by events. And frankly, governments trying to hold on to it was probably a sign of desperation on the government sides to trying to thinking and believing that treaties were what would create peace. The good thing about all this scenario with naval aviation is that pretty much every navy had looked at their governments in treaties of that we can create peace by politics and by just having these agreements which will limit military power, and gone, we will try your way, but we'll prepare for the other way. We'll be planning, we'll be preparing, and we'll be thinking about it. Now, when it comes to wargaming, I would say the US Navy... The Royal Navy does have a strong wargaming character, and so does the Japanese Navy. I would say the way the US Navy wraps it into everything with the Naval War College and really pushes it through is something unique to the US Navy, and how they manage to push themselves through in that way. And that does give them... it gives them an edge. The Royal Navy has an edge of having the large fleets in peace and wartime, which allows it to do a lot of exercises. A lot of exercises. I mean, one of the interesting things about the American fleet problems, and one of the reasons that makes them so special, is they are rare as exercises. Whereas for the Royal Navy, they're having those sort of scale of exercises almost every 3-4 months. The Mediterranean Fleet and Atlantic Fleet get together for a bash. That's pretty much it. And that's what the Royal Navy is doing on a regular basis. The Japanese approach to wargaming, it's stricter in some regards. I would say that, again, this is the legacy of Sims, and this is where it matters the characters and personality involved. Sims had started a policy, and definitely even King had continued a policy, but certainly Reeves had pushed it through, of you were allowed to question and encouraged to question because we don't know the answers. A lot of the Japanese admirals in this period do not have, let's say, necessarily the confidence, I feel, there almost is. Or maybe it could be culture. There is an argument for culture, but I would say it's almost needing to stress how capable their navy is in the face of overwhelming odds. That it's almost a false confidence and bravado. That they put a lot of strictures on the naval war games. Which means they don't necessarily get things as predicted as well as they can be. One of the things that's interesting with naval war games is the Royal Navy is pretty much working out immediately with their war games how much of a problem they're in. They know they have not been resourced enough for a three-nation war. They can, in any scenario, they can hold Japan or pause one other in European theatre and fight Japan. They can fight both Germany and Italy. They cannot fight Germany, Italy, and Japan. They haven't got the resources. They haven't been allowed them because of the treaties. And this is compounded by Churchill's, and I know it's my favourite thing to come with, pausing of construction. The really interesting thing, of course, though, is that the US Navy doesn't pause construction in 1939. They're not at war till 1941. And so their capital ships, their carriers, their whole swarm of construction starts to come through. And the Yorktowns, along with Saratoga and Lexington, really are used to show the need of the large carrier for their kind of operations, for their style of operations. The Ranger, it's not something they want to take into war, but they'll use it in exercises because it's got that big air group. And it can be used. It can be used. And then come along the Wasp and the Hornet. The Wasp is, again, another attempt at making this carrier concept work. It's another attempt at going, we can do this. We can do this. We can make this baby carrier idea work. We can build a ship of 14,900 tons and it can carry up to 100 aircraft. We can do this. And they use it. They do use it in the Pacific, and it is a far better design than the Ranger. But there is a reason Hornet is another Yorktown, not another Wasp. There is a reason for it. Because it's those extra 5,200 tons in standard displacement. And, let's be honest, almost an extra 6,000 tons when fully loaded that make a big difference in operational capabilities, in how you can support and generate your aviation capability in your aviation component. And I would argue again, the Wasp is another attempt to try and, can we get the size of carrier, the large carrier we need, on a smaller hull and a quicker to produce hull? And the answer is, we can, but it's a fudge and it's not really what we want. Especially when you start to go into their approach, because the Americans' approach to air defense of the fleet, especially in carrier defense, is space, maneuverability of the carrier, time, how we can spread ourselves out, and hopefully having an alert of where the enemy is so we can strike them first. The best defense of a carrier is sinking the enemy carrier. That is what they're approaching from. And they have that scenario in the Pacific to spare for. Now, one of the criteria they're also thinking of is, can we rapidly produce carriers? Can we rapidly produce carriers? Because that's their other security. Rapidly producing them. And sustaining them. And they have an advantage there. Because they're looking at their fights as being, they are a two-ocean navy. That is part of their doctrine. But the thing is, A, those oceans are linked by the Panama Canal, which they've done a lot of exercise on how to defend. But B, those oceans, they have a coast on both oceans. Whereas for the Royal Navy, grappling the same task, they are Atlantic, Mediterranean, an Indian, Pacific Navy. And they have to deal with the fact that they only have coastline from their industrial hub in the Atlantic. They have infrastructure and all these things to support and sustain the fleet, but not to create the fleet, not to do the massive repairs. And so anything they want to deploy to those other fleets, they have to deploy a long way. They can't rely on the ability to get it back home for massive repair and get it quickly out to operations again. Because they can't do that. Saying that, though, the Americans have a problem in that they don't have the infrastructure they want or need physically built on those sides, which is one of the reasons why the Two-Ocean Navy 1940 plan is so important to the growth of their doctrine, development of their thinking, because that is about building the infrastructure and putting in place a lot of systems which then support their war effort. And this is where you get the really big divergence in the doctrinal thinking, because the Japanese are placing their doctrine, I'll be getting discussing about trying to punch above their weight, trying to trit the enemy forces down to a point they're manageable, but also trying to punch above their weight, achieve something beyond their initial force size and capability can achieve. The British are trying to have a battle fleet which can fight in all seasons around the world, and provide them with the forces which they can wage a war, a global conflict. And the Americans are building a fleet which will allow them to dominate their defensive depth. And their defensive depth is the Atlantic and the Pacific. That's their security. As long as you can keep the enemy on the outside of the Atlantic or the outside of the Pacific, America is safe. And that's the important thing. And this whole strategic theory is filtering into their doctrine. That's why we can see the difference in the carriers. And the choices they're making under those treaty limitations. They've tried twice, under treaty limitations, realistically, to try and get this through. Wasp is laid down in 1936, still under the First London Naval Treaty. Still under that treaty. And now, why do I say this? Because it's laid down April 1936, and the treaty, I keep talking about it, it's technically signed in March 1936. Well, the thing is, the treaty doesn't really come into force, or does really come into force, after April 1937, because it's supposed to keep the First London Naval Treaty going, the Second London Naval Treaty, apart from removing the cumulative limitations. But, more importantly, it has an escalator clause in it that only applies if Japan and Italy haven't signed by the 1st of April 1937. And of course they don't. But that means until April 1937, you have to, as a government and as a navy, be prepared for the reality that you might have to deal with a renegotiation of the treaty, and it might come back to the same cumulative limits. And that is one of the reasons why the Americans wait till 1939 to lay down the Hornet. And also one of the reasons why the Wasp actually takes so long to be built. You know, she's laid down in April 1936, she's launched in April 1939, and commissioned in April 1940. Whereas Hornet is laid down September 1939, launched December 1940, and commissioned October 1941. She's practically raced through. She's in service before the Americans get attacked at Pearl Harbor. And then we have the Essex Swarm. And they are an Essex Swarm because any class which is planned to be 32 and 24 of them are completed. That's colossal. And when we consider that their design and everything that's put into building them, well, USS Essex is ordered in July 1940. She's laid down in April 1941. She is commissioned in December 1942. Yorktown, which was originally going to be Bonhomme Richard, but after the Yorktown of the Yorktown class is lost, well, she is laid down in December 1941, commissioned, launched January 1943, and commissioned April 1943. Most of the rest of the Swarm are like that. They are December 1941 keel laying down, and soon commissioned. Soon commissioned. But the class does read like a, oh, we've lost our carrier, we're replacing our carrier. Because the first of the class go Essex, Yorktown, Intrepid, Hornet, and Franklin. If you carry on down the list, eventually you get to Lexington. And Wasp. The US Navy lost a lot of carriers in World War II. They also sunk a lot of carriers. And that wasn't something bad or really massively negative in their doctrine. Okay, they have set up a doctrine which suits their scenario, which fits their line. Usually what happens when they lose their ships is it more because the doctrine has either not been properly executed, or more often not could not be properly executed because of the scenario they find themselves in. Or it's because they're in one of the few scenarios where the doctrine honestly didn't think about it. One of the questions which was asked post-World War II was where in wargaming the US Navy had factored in kamikazes. They hadn't. Until it happened, they hadn't. Can you hold that up as an accusation against them? Why would anyone expect that? Now, you could say, well, have you read Japanese history? Have you read these things? Do you see where it can come from in a culture, and yes, you can. But you can make those same claims about any culture. The British have, in their culture, a history which involves invoking the patron saint of your country, and that means you fight to the end. Um, it's not as talked about as much today, and it's not a massive part in our history books, but it is there. It was still there. And that's part of our history. Could that have been adapted and evolved by culture? Potentially, caught in a bad scenario. The Greeks have the history of the Spartans and others who have done similarly heroic but ultimately futile last stands. It's part of history which comes about, but no one ever really expects it to be repeated in certain forms. Conversely, I would say their doctrine expands quite well. There are tactical innovations as well, and one of the things about their US Naval Doctrine is it encouraged people like FAC to come up with a FAC weave, to come up with their own tactical thinking beneath it. And this is where you get into a lot of interesting discussions, because some people sometimes confuse the doctrinal layer with the operational layer, i.e. how we're doing something, not why we're doing something. Doctrine is why we're doing something and what we hope to achieve by doing something. The tactical and operational level is the meat and bones of, we put this ship here, it launches this strike there, then that. That's what we're talking about. The aircraft are going to be doing this, or they're going to be weaving in and out, so that anyone trying to attack, they can shoot at them before they can line up and attack. And even then, sometimes a lot of those tactics, like the FAC weave, etc., they're great, but they're like bayonet drill. Before many of the battles in the UK, when early bayonet drill was being adopted, it's more about giving you confidence in your fighter's performance against the opponent than is necessarily in actually doing the victory itself. But overall, the doctrine allows for, we need to carry maximum aircraft, we need to launch the maximum aircraft. And when you think about the later war innovations of the big blue blanket, well, that is pure. You can trace the line back to Sims. Whoever hits the carrier first wins. Whoever can launch the most aircraft the quickest wins the battle. That's their argument for how they deal with land aviation threats. And that's the big blue blanket. The problem is with all of that, is implementing it in the period when aircraft are getting faster, and I'm talking into the couple of 100 miles an hour or quicker, and you haven't got radar. You haven't got the ability to reach out and see aircraft from a long way away to give you time to launch. You haven't got the radio controls, and you haven't got the aircraft to maintain a combat air patrol. And let's be honest, the cap is the big innovation. Once you've got the radar to coordinate the cap and direct it, once you've got the radios to coordinate the cap and direct it, once you've got the systems in place that you can coordinate and direct those aircraft, the cap becomes the major thing. And honestly, that is the innovation. And that comes about in the US Navy and the Royal Navy at very similar times. Different methodologies. The Royal Navy, to an extent, gets there a little bit first, but from a different direction. And when I say a little bit first, in that is kind of like dive bombing. It's how do you define a cap? Because this is the really difficult thing. They are developing the concept, so they don't have a definition of it at the time when they're doing it. So anytime we go back and we're looking for the beginning of this thing, well, do we go with the first time they called it a combat air patrol? Or do we go the first time they're doing that type of patrol with that concept of operation? Do you go the first time they are doing it in an exercise and testing it out as an idea? Because then you can take the cap back to the 1920s. But it takes them a while to develop these things. And the doctrine evolves to take that into account. And the doctrine started off taking that into account in the US case, thanks to Sims. And I'd say thanks to Reeves and his questions. And this is really where I wanted to finish today, is with this all, is not really a conclusion, but with a set of questions. And it is Reeves' questions. And this is where I would say in 1926 he earns his title as father of US naval aviation and its doctrine. Because he writes this: when should control of the air be undertaken? How far and in what manner should efforts to gain control of the air extend? How proceed if control of the air is gained versus if not gained? Considering the vital importance of control of the air, does our present basic air organization provide sufficient fighting planes? Can we deny enemy planes tactical scouting? And how can aircraft best aid surface craft during this phase? Reeves is pushing things forward by asking questions. And that is the base point of US naval doctrine. Whether you're talking about their development of their strikes that lead to the carrier raids in 1942, whether you're talking about their battle doctrine of seek out enemy carrier, destroy enemy carrier first, then attack the rest of the fleet. That's their primary aim. Whether you're talking about their reconnaissance profile of trying to find that information and integrating land-based maritime patrol aircraft into that information network so they can find out what the enemy's doing. All this is based on the understanding of air power as in both an enabler of sea power and as a significant component of sea power, an offensive component of sea power from its earliest point. Anyway, hope you've enjoyed this. I was wondering what question to really put at the end, and I've decided to say the question at the end is, I'd like to hear your answers to Reeves' questions. I'd like to hear what you think the answers should be to Reeves' questions. You can write them as you would if you think you would in the 1920s, or you could write them today. I think it's still a worthwhile exercise to ask those questions. Because as I said, the answers change. The world changes. History changes, technology changes, and methodologies change. But doctrine doesn't necessarily need to change. It evolves. Slowly, sometimes, but honestly, that often fits. Because technology might change at a pace, but ability to use that technology usually doesn't keep up. Sadly, for those who are the techno-prophets. So what we've got coming up? Well, next week it's the treaty carriers. The Washington treaty carriers. And the London treaty carriers. It should be fun. It could also be quite big. The fact that I've got the Lexington class the following week as their own video might give you a idea of there are possibly going to be bits I'm going to be skipping a little bit over. Because there's only so much space in one video. And this one, I think, is already well into nearly the 2 hour, over the 2 hour territory, possibly. Definitely going to be near it. Thank you very much for watching. Hope you enjoyed. If you like the video, please do like, maybe share, subscribe. And yeah, that's very much an introduction to US Naval Aviation Doctrine. You might have noticed I didn't mention night strikes as part of it. And to summarize that, the US Navy are interested in night operations, but they're more interested in generating the maximum volume of strike and the maximum volume of operations. And so that's where their research and emphasis goes to. And that's the reality of the interwar years. You're not interested in something, you don't not value something, it's you have X amount of funds. What do you want to do with that funding? If you do one thing with it, you cannot spend the same pound, the same dollar, the same yen twice. You can't. You can only spend it once. So the choice is up to you, but it also means the choice is up to you. Thank you very much for watching, and hope you enjoyed.